What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode we are going to be going over damage decay and damage scaling in our fighting game tutorial series. Damage scaling is the process of decreasing the amount of damage done on each hit in a combo. Up to this point, our damage has been linear, so as we are attacking our opponent, they are losing the same amount of health every time. However, what we actually want to happen is do less damage over time while our combo counter increases. We are going to be doing this one a little bit more live today than regular because there are a lot of changes to the take damage function, and I wanted to make sure that it was clear to everybody without just changing it while you guys couldn't see it. Anyway, before we get started, I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for all the love and support. Very grateful and excited to knock out another episode that you guys requested, so thank you so much for doing that. Now, if you want to get caught up in this series before you watch this episode, I believe we're on episode 169, so we've done a lot before this. We still have a lot to go, but the game is really coming together. If you want to check it out, feel free to click on this iCard right here in the top right corner. You can check out everything we've done to this point. Alternatively, you can click on this icon in the top right corner right here if you're just interested in our combo system. I'll link you to the first part of combos right here, and we are going to be building on that system, so you will want to watch that before you watch this one. With that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. The first thing we want to do is go into our code today, and we want to go to our fighter template character.h. So this is my base character, and we've done all sorts of logic in here. Recently, we've added something called hitstun decay. So I'm scrolling down to my floats, and I have one called a hitstun decay modifier. This hitstun decay modifier is essentially how fast or how slow we want this hitstun decay to occur. We went over all the logic in the hitstun decay episode, but we're going to basically take this same method that we're using here for the damage decay. There are a lot of differences, but there's a lot of similarities as well. So we're going to explore both of those so you can kind of see how they impact each other and which parts are different and why. So below this variable, I made another variable, another float, called damage decay modifier. And as the comment says, the damage decay or scaling that occurs during combos, and it can be set for linear or scaling effect the same as the hitstun decay modifier. Also made it a U property that's edit anywhere, blueprint read write with the category of combo. This way we can see it in the blueprints and also edit it and utilize it. Now we can go to our fighter template character.cpp, and we want to go to the constructor, and we want to set this value. For me, I set it to 2.0, the same thing that I set the hitstun decay modifier to, because it's an easy value to work with and you can really test and see if things are working. So essentially I want to decay at a rate of 2. Won't make too much sense right now until you see it in action. Alright, at this point we can scroll down to take damage. And take damage is here for me. It's a pretty big function, pretty complicated. That's why we're going to be going over it live today. Alright, so in take damage we had added a should ignore hitstun decay boolean, which is for moves that just ignore hitstun decay. So if you have a move that should apply its amount of hitstun every attack, every time you hit it, no matter where you are in a combo, that boolean would be true. We are going to implement the same method for the damage decay as well. So I've added a new boolean called should ignore damage decay. So let's go back into the fighter template character for a second and scroll down to our take damage function. Here's my take damage function, and you can see at the end of my long parameter list, I've added a should ignore damage decay that I've set to false by default. So most moves won't ignore damage decay, but if we have any that do, any that should always hit with the same amount of strength, never lose any of their damage on hit, regardless of where a character is at in their combo, we want this boolean to be true. So we're going to default it to false. Bool should ignore damage decay equals false. Then back in the fighter template character CPP, we want to make sure we do add this parameter to the parameter list. Remember that for parameters that you set a default value for, we don't have to also set the default value in the CPP. We can just write out the name of the boolean, and we'll be good to go. So you see in the very first section here, we check to make sure we're not in a super event because that logic can be just completely different. There's a lot of unique things about this super property and super moves in general. So I'm ignoring that one. If we're not in a super, we go into this here. Which point we check to see and make sure the character is not able to block. So the character taking damage, if they were unable to block under any circumstances, we know they are taking the damage from the hitbox. We go into this if statement. Now, additionally, in there, we check to see if the character that's taking damage is currently in the attack started state. Basically, if they're taking damage at this point, they were counter hit. You'll notice during counter hit, we never implemented any sort of hitstun decay. This is because you can't really be counter hit if you're in a combo. If you're in a combo, you will never reach the attack started state. And so we can actually skip it for the damage decay as well. So we're going to go to the else. So assuming the character has not blocked and they're not in the counter hit state, we're just doing the standard damage to them. This is where we care to change and implement our damage decay logic. Right off the bat, when we take player health and subtract damage amount from it, that's no longer what we want to do. We want to make sure that we are factoring in damage decay. So to factor in damage decay, I am going to go above that player health minus equals damage amount line. And remember, this is the damage amount coming in from the hitbox or the attack that had damaged them. And let's write an if statement and say if not should ignore damage decay. So if we shouldn't ignore damage decay on this move, we're going to want to implement damage decay. Else, that means we should ignore damage decay, which that just means we can actually use the same logic we already had in here, player health minus equals damage amount. We're not factoring in damage decay, so just take whatever value we get in the damage amount parameter and use that. And if we should factor in damage decay, if we should not ignore it, then we instead want to set player health to be our damage amount that is being passed in minus the other player combo counter multiplied by the damage decay modifier. Now you'll notice this is very similar to our hitstun decay because the logic is essentially the same. There's a little bit different here because instead of just setting a value outright, like the number of stun frames, we're taking it from our current value of our health. So it's not a direct set, we're doing minus equals, but it's the same basic idea. We're taking the damage amount passed in to this take damage function call, and then using the other player's combo counter multiplied by the damage decay modifier to get our actual answer here. Now let's do a quick paint example, because it is slightly more complicated than this as well. Let's say we have 80% of our health remaining, or basically 0.8, because remember player health is a ratio of 0 to 1, so 1 is 100% of their health remaining, and 0 is 0% of their health remaining. So we can do 8 minus our damage amount. Okay, 8 minus our damage amount. Let's say that we do 0.1, or basically 10% of the character's health every time we hit this one attack. That's ignoring damage scaling. Then we have to subtract by the other player's combo counter. So let's assume that combo counter is 4. They're on a 4-hit combo. And multiply by the damage decay modifier, which is what we set in the constructor. So when we do this, we're going to get 0.8 minus 0.1 minus 8. Now, when you look at this, you're like, what? That's not going to make any sense, because when we do 0.1 minus 8, we're going to get a negative value. We're going to end up adding to the player health. What we can do to solve this is simply take the result of other player combo counter times damage decay modifier and convert that into the same units. So if we were to divide 8 by 100, we would get 0.08, which would get us an appropriate value. So let's try that. 0.8 minus 0.1 minus 0.08. And now this will get you 0.8 minus 0.02. Then we're going to get our final result of 0.78. Now, mathematically, this works. Honestly, it's a little harsh. The That's a little bit too much damage decay in my opinion. So while we are here, after I've actually done the math, I am going to go back up to my damage decay modifier and change this to something like 1.25. The math will still work the same, it's not a problem there, but it will allow us to continue doing good damage for a little bit longer in our logic here. But implementing that one little change that I added, this is what our logic is going to look like. Now, it's not required that you put these other parentheses because the order of operations will take this multiplication first on this object before it subtracts it from the damage amount. But I think this is visually the easiest way to understand it. So we're going to take our player health and subtract and set it equal to the damage amount coming in from this hitbox minus the other player's combo counter multiplied by the damage decay modifier, then all of that multiplied by 0.1 to put it in the same ratio that player health is treated as to get our final result in the player health. Now, I would recommend that we log this just to make sure that it's working as intended. So we have our initial log here. I'm actually going to add another one in here as to not disrupt the flow. I know I have a lot of commented out logs. That's just for convenience so that the log isn't being overloaded. What I want to do at this point is make sure we can print this out. So you see I've copied my log here, and now we can't just paste this in, as it won't really help us. If we try and do this, it won't allow us to put that in the log. What we should do is actually calculate this. So we can say float damage with decay and set it equal to this algorithm that we've added here. And now we know how much damage there is going to be subtracted from player health. So now what we can actually do is get rid of our logic here and subtract equals damage with decay. So we're doing the same thing. I'm just putting it into a variable so we can track it. And then at this point, we can use our log that I was adding in here and paste it right below where we set the damage with decay. And instead of using our damage amount, we can use damage with decay. But instead of saying the character is taking damage for this amount of points, since I just copied the log, we want to make sure it's relevant to what it is that we are doing. So we want to say the damage after damage decay is, and then we're going to say %F to make sure that we can add this damage with decay float value in that log. One other quick note I should add, we were checking to see if other player existed, and it was a big part of the last episode where I made sure that other player existed before doing some of the logic we were doing. We should technically make sure that other player is valid here, because if not, the combo counter is not going to be allowed to be here. Trying to access the other player's combo counter will cause a crash, and we don't want to do that. The absolute easiest way to do this is actually just to add an AND check on this should ignore other damage decay and say if other player. Because if there is no other player, we will then automatically go into the else statement and it will just do the regular damage. There will be no damage decay. But you could move this around and make sure it's within another if other player statement. However you want to set it up is fine. Just make sure you do check for other player before doing this, otherwise we could cause a crash. Now, you could also include this damage decay during the blocking, this else statement here, where we set our reduced damage and subtract reduced damage from that player health. If you want to do it, you can essentially just take the exact same thing that we did and use it with this reduced damage instead of damage amount in the front. And we need to make sure that the character is currently in a combo, because even with this, they might not be in a combo. The first hit that is done will still have this math implemented, and it will take away from the player's health, but it shouldn't do that. So we only want to do this the same way as we did our hitstun decay if the num stun frames of this character is greater than 0. That means that they are in a combo. So if num stun frames is greater than 0, and we should not ignore damage decay, and the other player exists, we can go into this logic. Speaking of, guys, if you go to your hitstun decay, if statement here. We should add if other player exists. My apologies for missing that in the other episode. Just a little safeguard, but in case you don't have another player for whatever reason, it will not crash. Now this is perfect. Our damage decay will only occur when the character is already within a combo. If they're not in a combo, if it's a standard hit, then they're going to receive the full damage. This is linear damage decay. If you do want the damage decay to be scaling and not linear, you can do another thing that I showed during the hitstun decay episode, which is where we increment the amount of damage decay after each successful hit. It will of course be reset when end combo is called. That way once the combo ends, we can reset it. If you'd like to do that, by all means, you do it just by incrementing your damage decay once the damage with decay has already been calculated. So we can do damage decay modifier plus equals 0.25. Very small, but this will allow it to scale over time instead of being linear. That is up to you. Again, if you want it to be linear, do not do this line, but if you do want it to be scaling, then we can go ahead and say update the damage decay modifier for scaling decay. And you'll notice this is the same as the hitstun decay modifier. Again, we incremented it after each hit. If you are doing the scaling decay, however, you want to make sure that you go to the end combo function that we've set up in previous episodes. So end combo right here. We were resetting the hitstun decay modifier back to 2.0. We want to make sure that we are doing that for the damage decay modifier as well. So my initial value for that was 1.25. Now, once the combo ends, we will reset the damage decay modifier to the default value that we had in the constructor. Another thing we should do when we're in here is make sure that our last damage received is set properly. This is used for things like our frame data for practice mode, but we do want to make sure that it's correct regardless. And so if we want to factor in the damage with decay, we can take the last damage received equals damage amount times 100, which remember, it's just getting it into the same readable units. Instead of using like 0.1, it'll be 1, like it was 1 damage. We can take that and copy it and put it inside the else of this if else, because if we're doing the regular attack and there's no damage scaling, no damage decay, then this last damage received will still be correct. However, if that is not the case, we actually want to set last damage received to be our damage with decay times 100, like this. This will make sure that last damage received is correct, regardless if the character had damage scaling and damage decay, or if they didn't have damage decay. So either method is accounted for. Even another thing that we should add is to make sure that damage with decay does not go below 0. We can do this with a clamp. So you can do a simple check, like an if check, to see if it's less than 0, set it equal to 0, like this. If damage with decay is less than 0.00, damage with decay equals 0.00. And I'll even do this. If it's less than 0.1, it equals 0.01. That way your attack can never not do damage, but it can do very little damage. One other quick thing we should do with this is actually move the log below the if statement where we did that clamp for the damage with decay, because if we don't and the damage with decay doesn't get reset to this value, then it will print the old value. So we should put this log right before we subtract it from player health. Actually, guys, there's one mistake here as well. So the end combo function is called on the character that performed the combo, so the attacker. But we were resetting the hitstun decay and the damage decay modifiers when the combo ended. We should actually be setting them for the other player instead, since the other player's hitstun decay modifier and damage decay modifier should be reset when they exit the combo. So make sure you update both of these to say other player. Otherwise, the logic is solid and we can continue to use it, but my mistake there. My apologies that I did not catch that in the previous episode or until this point. Now at this point, let's go to our hitbox actor.h and we want to go to our structure that I called fHitbox data, and this is where all of our data for the hitboxes is. Scrolling down, I want to add another variable, should ignore damage decay. So I have should ignore hitstun decay, and now I've added should ignore damage decay. So U property, edit anywhere, blueprint, read write, category of hitbox. This will allow us to set it in the data table, so we can determine for each hitbox if it should ignore damage decay. And remember, you don't have to set it in the CPP because those are values in a structure, not a class. And we haven't done it for the other hitbox elements. Once the editor is back open, we want to make sure that we can actually utilize this logic by doing a few things. A, we need to actually pass along the should ignore damage decay for each move to the hitbox. And B, we need to update our data table to support this. So our mutant hitbox data should have all of our hitboxes in it. And now a new Boolean exists, should ignore damage decay. So if you want to ignore it, you check this box. Otherwise, it'll be false by default. And then damage decay will not be ignored for that hitbox. We will test this a little bit later in the episode, but for now, let's make sure that we can pass along all the proper data. So let's go into our animation blueprint. And in there, we're going to use the same functions that we did for the hitstun decay, which is our create active, create projectile, and create throw hitbox. Create active hitbox is the one that handles our strike hitbox. So let's go here. My M rifle punch active is my basic attack that I spam all the time, and the one that I'm spamming to create the combo. Where I have this notify, I'm grabbing my data table row at this value. This is light attack hitbox 2. So it's the strike hitbox, and it has all this data in it. We break that data and pass along everything into our create active hitbox function. Well, create active hitbox now should have another Boolean, and you probably guessed it, but it is our should ignore damage decay Boolean. So yet again, you can add another variable here, another input parameter, and you can have the should ignore damage decay as a Boolean. Once you add this, all your create active hitboxes will have this variable here. Then we can pass it in from the break hitbox data. If you don't see the Boolean, should ignore damage decay on your break hitbox data, you can just click on the node and make sure you have should ignore damage decay checked as pin. This means it will show up. If you uncheck it, it will hide it. Then just pass it from one to the other, and we can go into create active hitbox. In here, I now have should ignore damage decay, so I've added a reroute node to pass it along. But if you're familiar with this function, essentially what we do is we spawn a hitbox in this function, an actual actor, not just a data structure, and then we pass along all of our data from the data table to it. So here is my should ignore damage decay, and you can see it's being plugged into the set members and hitbox data. Again, just like the break, make sure you click on set members and hitbox data and check should ignore damage decay as pin. That way you can see it and actually set it here. So essentially, should ignore damage decay from the function should go into should ignore damage decay in the set members. Now, this is good enough for strike hitboxes, but our projectiles and our throw hitboxes can also ignore damage decay. So if you want to implement that, I'm going to give you the same examples as we saw during the hitstun decay episode. So if we go to our spawn homing thunderball, that is the electric ball that is actually tracking the player's movements, so it kind of locks onto them. We go here, we were spawning the actor, then we were getting the appropriate hitbox for that projectile. We were breaking the hitbox data, and here we have should ignore damage decay. It already is available for me, but my create projectile hitbox doesn't have a Boolean for it. So I'm going to add a new parameter, and of course I'm going to call it should ignore damage decay. It is a Boolean. Now I can pass it from the break into the function, and then it calls spawn projectile. Now once you do this, you can go into your create projectile hitbox function, and this one I haven't set up yet, so I will do it live. I now have should ignore damage decay. Make another reroute node here, and I can simply go over to where I want to put it, add a reroute node here, and it disconnected, but we basically want to just have some reroute nodes, so that's a little bit more visually appealing. If I click on my set members and hitbox data node here, you can see that should ignore damage decay is not checked. We want to check it so that we can pass in our Boolean. That's simple. Now, create throw hitbox is the last one that will work with that, because we don't need to set up create proximity hitbox. It doesn't make sense, as the proximity hitbox never deals damage, and thus we don't need to worry about damage decay. So going back into the event graph one more time. Here is my backward throw grab active. This is the anim notify, where we actually land the throw. This is the grab anim notify, so this is when we actually grab our opponent. The damage isn't dealt right here. We just spawn the hitbox that determines if we've been able to grab them. But we still want to pass along the should ignore damage decay here, just in case we ever want to deal damage there, or for when we actually deal damage, we can pull the data from this logic. If you did want to do damage here, however, you could. There's nothing against it, and some grabs do deal a little bit of damage on connection. So you know what we're going to do by now. We are going to make sure that we add a new input parameter, and we're going to call it should ignore damage decay. That is a Boolean. We pass in our should ignore damage decay from the broken hitbox data. We then go into our create throw hitbox. And again, you can probably guess, but we're going to make a reroute node. And we're going to bring that into another reroute node. Keeps breaking it for some reason, not sure why. Doesn't normally do that. Then we want to make sure that we go to our set members in hitbox data, check our should ignore damage decay so that we can see it, and actually pass it in from the parameter in the function. At this point, all of our different throws, projectiles, and strike hitboxes will be able to support that should ignore damage decay Boolean. One other thing I wanted to show you while we're here. Now down here is apply throw damage. This is where the character that is thrown actually hits the ground, and that is the point where we apply the damage for the throw. I have a separate entry in my data table for this called backward throw damage, and I've explained this many times throughout the series, so you most likely are familiar with this if you've been watching the series. But here is where you would say something like should ignore damage decay if you wanted the actual damage from the throw to be ignored. And this works the same way. Just make sure that you pass the should ignore damage decay into that box for the take damage if you are using this method. It is viable, so by all means, feel free to set that up. With all this done, we can go to the hitbox actor BP, and this is where we can really make sure that the take damage has everything that it needs. So here's my hitbox actor BP. And I've done this for the last few episodes, but honestly I think it is the best method, so I'm going to do it again. I'm going to press Control F to find and just type in take damage and see all the places I call take damage. Take damage now takes in should ignore damage decay as a parameter, so we want to make sure we update all of our spots where we call take damage from the hitbox actor BP to include this Boolean. Now the first two that I have in this list are part of this red comment, and this comment is the original event I use for reference for helping others through this tutorial and these tutorials, so I don't have to update it there as it wasn't relevant at that point. But starting with this one, I have two take damage function calls, and they are part of my projectile collision logic that we set up many episodes ago. But for both of these take damage function calls, we want to make sure that we pass in the should ignore damage decay from the hitbox data, break hitbox data that we have right here. Everything else is already being passed in there except for the location for projectiles, so it makes sense to pass this in as well because projectiles can have the ignore damage decay property. So these are the next two, and the very last one is up here, and this is for strike hitboxes specifically. So this is part of our event check collision. And this is where we've determined that a collision has occurred with a strike hitbox and a character, so we call take damage on that character. We already have a broken hitbox data structure here that we can go ahead and pass should ignore damage decay from here into the take damage function. I'm going to clean it up with some reroute nodes. And now we are good to go. Everywhere has that property. We can now test out our game. So let's go into the project. And I will skip the intros and entrances and we'll go to the output log. And at this point, I can attack my character. You'll see on the first hit, there's no damage decay, so the log doesn't print. But if I keep the combo going by spamming this button, you'll see that the damage is getting less each time until it reaches the minimum, which is 0.1. Eventually, the combo will drop, and the logic will begin again. If we do one more thing, we can go back into our mutant hitbox data, and I can go to that attack that I was spamming and ignore damage decay. If I save that and allow the attack to ignore damage decay, and we load up our match again, go to the output log, you'll notice that the log will never print no matter what value I'm at on the combo, and that's because the damage decay branch isn't even being taken, and that's how it should be. We're ignoring the decay, so we're not doing that logic. If you want, you could actually print out the value, and you would see that it is not doing anything, but that's not required. We know that it is not updating the damage based off of any sort of decay. So there you go, guys. That's how you can add damage decay into your game. I hope this helped you, and I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please subscribe. It does more for myself in the series than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out again to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for all the love and support. I really appreciate it. Very excited for what we can do with this in the future. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to help you out, get you sorted with any issues you had. But like I said, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.